Along the eastern edge of the Adirondacks, in the hill country outside Cooperstown, New York, in December of 2021, a hunter tracking deer sign through a stand of leafless hardwoods saw movement break from a hedgerow at the edge of a frozen field. He raised his rifle. He fired. He walked up expecting to find what he had found in this county 100 times before, a coyote, lean and fast, 35 or 40 pounds at most, already going stiff in the cold. What he found instead did not sit right in his arms. The animal was heavy through the chest, thick in the neck, with a head that looked, even to an untrained eye, wrong for the body type he expected. When he finally hauled it onto his tailgate and put it on a scale, the reading came back at 85 pounds. He did what any hunter proud of an unusual kill does. He took photographs. He posted them online, the way hunters have shared trophy stories for generations, thinking nothing more of it than that he had shot an exceptionally large coyote. He was wrong. But in that moment, standing in the snow, nobody could prove it yet. 85 pounds does not resolve cleanly against a coyote's paperwork. It sits in a gap, far above the weight of even a big male eastern coyote, but not, by itself, conclusive proof of anything else in a state whose wildlife agencies have not recognized a native breeding wolf population within its borders for well over a century. The photographs began to circulate among hunters, then among wolf advocates, who noticed something in the skull shape, the leg length, the set of the jaw, that didn't match the animal everyone assumed it was. Eventually, a tissue sample was pulled from the mounted specimen at a taxidermist's shop in the town of Cherry Valley and shipped north across the Canadian border for genetic testing. The results would not come back for months, and when they did, two separate, credentialed laboratories would not agree on what they meant. To understand how one dead animal on a truck tailgate could become a genuine scientific dispute, it helps to understand exactly what the official record says happened to wolves in the Northeast, and how firmly institutions have held that line. New York State traces the disappearance of its native wolf to the late 19th century. The commonly cited final chapter belongs to a trapper named Reuben Carey, credited with killing the last known native wolf in the western Adirondacks near Brandreth Lake in November of 1893, a kill still referenced in regional museum exhibits more than 130 years later, because for a very long time, nothing came afterward to complicate the story. By the early 20th century, the same pattern had repeated itself across nearly the entire eastern half of the country. Bounty programs, organized trapping campaigns, and the clearing of forest for agriculture pushed the gray wolf out of New England, out of New York, out of Pennsylvania and the Central Appalachians, and eventually out of nearly the entire Great Lakes Basin, except for a handful of remote strongholds in northern Minnesota and the Canadian boreal forest. Today, New York's Department of Environmental Conservation lists the gray wolf as an endangered species with no established resident population anywhere in the state. Any wolf discovered within New York's borders is treated, by definition, not as a resident, but as a rare, temporary visitor, a disperser who wandered a great distance, and, more often than not, wandered directly into a hunter's rifle before anyone realized what had actually been killed. That is the frame every large canid carcass in this region is measured against. Absent overwhelming proof otherwise, a big animal shot in the New York woods is assumed by default to be a coyote, specifically the large regional hybrid population known informally as the eastern coyote. The wolf, administratively, left this landscape in 1893 and has not returned in any way that counts as permanent. But that framing rests on an assumption worth examining directly, that a species which disappears from a landscape as a distinct, countable population has also disappeared from that landscape's underlying biology. The question is not simply whether wolves occasionally wander into New York from the Great Lakes region. Even cautious wildlife agencies now concede that this happens rarely when a young disperser crosses hundreds of miles of modern landscape on foot. The real question is larger than any single wandering animal. The question is whether the wolf ever needed to walk back in as a wolf at all, or whether, for most of the last 90 years, it has already been here the entire time, folded invisibly into a species that was never on anyone's endangered list, hiding in plain sight inside the genome of the ordinary northeastern coyote. To take that question seriously, you first have to look at how coyotes actually arrived in the Northeast, because the route matters as much as the animal itself. Coyotes are historically a species of the open American West, grassland and scrub specialists that evolved hunting rabbits and rodents across the Great Plains. They were never native to the dense hardwood forest of New York or New England. Their presence east of the Mississippi is almost entirely a 20th century phenomenon, and researchers who have mapped that expansion describe it moving along two distinct fronts. The southern front pushed east through the Midwest, through Ohio, down through the mid-Atlantic states, and into the Appalachians, territory where wolves had already been eliminated so early and so thoroughly that there was almost no remaining wolf population left for an arriving coyote to encounter. The northern front took a different path entirely. It moved east through Ontario, along the southern edge of the Great Lakes, straight through a region where a remnant wolf population, variously classified over the decades as gray wolf, Great Lakes wolf, or the still contested eastern wolf, a lineage whose exact species status remains formally unresolved even now, continued to hold on in the boreal forest north of the lakes and around Algonquin Provincial Park. For a coyote population moving east along that specific corridor, geography created a bottleneck, the St. Lawrence River, the natural divide separating southern Ontario and Quebec from northern New York and New England. Any coyote population crossing that river in that era had, almost by necessity, first passed directly through active wolf territory. That corridor is exactly where geneticists have since found the signature of hybridization. Not on the southern front, where the wolf was already functionally gone before the coyote ever arrived. Only on the northern front, the single route that carried the new arrival directly through the last strongholds of the very species it appeared, on paper, to be quietly replacing. The expansion itself was extraordinarily fast by the standards of large mammal range shifts. A species that evolved hunting small prey on open plains rapidly colonized nearly the entire eastern half of North America over roughly 90 years. A shift dramatic enough that ecologists studying it have never been fully satisfied explaining it through habitat change alone. Part of the explanation sits on the wolf's side of the story, not the coyotes. As bounty hunting, trapping, and habitat fragmentation reduced wolf numbers across the Northeast and southern Ontario through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the wolves that survived were not vanishing into some clean, total absence. They were being reduced to scattered, low-density remnants. Packs broken apart, territories collapsed, and, critically, breeding opportunities with other wolves growing scarcer with every decade of continued persecution. Research into the Algonquin eastern wolf population has documented this mechanism directly. Intensive harvest of wolves in that specific region has been shown to correlate with increased hybridization rates, as surviving wolves, unable to locate mates of their own kind across a depleted range, paired instead with the expanding, opportunistic coyotes arriving from the west. Into that vacuum moved a closely related canid, in growing numbers, along the exact corridor where wolf remnants were making their last stand. Under those conditions, hybridization stops looking like a biological anomaly and starts looking like a predictable outcome. A wolf unable to find a wolf mate across a shrinking, disrupted range does not necessarily go childless, and every hybrid litter produced under that pressure carried wolf genes forward into a population that would keep expanding for generations, long after the last purebred wolf in that specific pocket of the Northeast had died out completely. The wolf did not go extinct there. It simply ran out of other wolves to breed with, and its genes kept moving anyway, carried forward inside a different name. Which brings the story back to the 85-pound animal shot near Cherry Valley in December of 2021. The first genetic test came from an unlikely source, not a state agency, but an advocacy-funded one. Wolf recovery activists, including members of the Northeast Ecological Recovery Society, arranged for a tissue sample from the mounted specimen to be shipped to the Natural Resources DNA Profiling and Forensic Center at Trent University in Ontario, a laboratory experienced in distinguishing wolf, coyote, and dog ancestry in North American canids. Funding for the analysis came from the nonprofit group Protect the Adirondacks. The results arrived in July of 2022. The animal tested at roughly 98% wolf. Broken down further, the profile showed just over half Great Lakes wolf ancestry, more than a third Northwest Territories wolf ancestry, close to 11% Eastern wolf ancestry, and only a small residual trace of coyote and dog genetics rounding out the total. New York's own environmental agency initially pushed back. A separate analysis, commissioned by the State Department of Environmental Conservation and conducted by the Wildlife Genetics Institute at East Stroudsburg University in Pennsylvania, concluded that the same animal was best classified as an eastern coyote carrying significant wolf ancestry, not a wolf outright. Two accredited laboratories, testing tissue pulled from the same dead animal, arrived at two different official answers. The disagreement was never about whether wolf DNA was present. Both labs agreed on that. The disagreement was about the exact point at which an animal carrying that much wolf ancestry stops being classified as a coyote and starts being classified as the species it primarily descends from. That question eventually landed with scientists at the New York State Museum. Zoologist Jeremy Kirchman led a closer investigation into the specimen, beginning with the skull, immeasurably larger than any coyote skull in the museum's comparative collection. His team then turned to the animal's teeth, pulling a molar and analyzing the carbon and nitrogen isotopes locked into the root, a technique the museum had developed specifically to distinguish a wild food diet from one supplemented by human garbage or corn-based agricultural feed. The isotope signature came back unambiguous. This was an animal that had eaten wild food at every stage of its life, with no evidence it had ever scavenged near a farm, a landfill, or a town. Combined with further DNA analysis conducted in partnership with researchers at Princeton University, the specimen was ultimately reclassified with roughly 99.9% Great Lakes gray wolf ancestry. Based on that isotope data and the known distribution of Great Lakes wolf populations, researchers estimated the animal had traveled somewhere between 500 and 750 miles, likely originating in Michigan, Minnesota, or Wisconsin, a dispersal distance well within the documented range of young wolves, which have been tracked wandering comparable distances elsewhere in North America in search of new territory and unrelated mates. It was shot less than a day's drive from where a trapper had killed New York's last known native wolf, 128 years earlier. It was not an isolated event. 2 decades earlier, in 2001, a hunter in Saratoga County, near the eastern boundary of the Adirondack Park, shot a 99-pound male canid, likewise assumed at first to be an unusually large coyote. Genetic testing proved it was a purebred gray wolf. Federal wildlife officials confiscated the remains under the Endangered Species Act. Museum researchers, using the same isotope method later applied to the Cherry Valley animal, again found evidence of a purely wild diet, a genuine disperser, not an escaped captive animal, having walked hundreds of miles into a state that had listed its species as gone since the 19th century. 2 full wolves, 2 decades apart, confirmed walking back into the exact landscape wolves had supposedly abandoned for good. And around those 2 headline cases sits a much larger, much quieter population. Not full wolves, but eastern coyotes carrying wolf ancestry at levels high enough to reshape their skeletons, without ever producing a specimen dramatic enough to force a reclassification fight. The Cherry Valley and Saratoga County wolves are the extreme, unambiguous cases, animals genetically close enough to pure wolf that even a skeptical agency eventually had to concede the point. The far more common, and in some ways more revealing, evidence sits one step removed, not in individual wolves wandering south, but inside the ordinary eastern coyote population that has occupied the Northeast for generations. In February of 2010, wildlife biologist Roland Case and colleagues at the New York State Museum published a study in the journal Biology Letters that remains the foundational genetic case for exactly this claim. The team analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 686 eastern coyotes and measured 196 skulls, mapping the results against the two-front colonization pattern already described. Their finding was precise and, at the time, genuinely surprising. Evidence of hybridization with Great Lakes wolves appeared only along the northern colonization front, the route through Ontario and across the St. Lawrence River, and that hybridization correlated directly with two measurable physical outcomes. Northern front coyotes carried larger skulls and greater size difference between males and females than their southern front counterparts. And the northern front expanded roughly 5 times faster than the southern one, a colonization advantage the researchers linked directly to the added size and predatory capability that wolf ancestry provided. Genetic diversity within that northern hybrid population was also unusually low, leading the researchers to a striking hypothesis. The entire hybrid lineage, now spread across New York and New England, may trace back to a small handful of wolf coyote females who crossed the St. Lawrence generations ago, carrying wolf genes into a coyote population and never looking back. A follow-up study published in 2014, led by researcher Javier Monzon, alongside Kay's and colleague Dean de Kuysen, used a panel of ancestry-informative genetic markers to screen coyotes across the wider eastern range and calculate exactly how much wolf ancestry individual animals carried. The most heavily admixed specimens in their sample carried somewhere between 39 and 42% wolf ancestry. Not a faint genetic echo, but nearly half a wolf's genome, running quietly through animals that state paperwork classifies, without qualification, as coyotes. If you want a way to hold that number in your head, think of it less like a rounding error and more like a chord. A pure coyote genome is one note. A pure wolf genome is another. What geneticists describe in the northeastern population isn't occasional static between the two. It's a sustained structural harmony, present in the DNA of hundreds of sampled animals across an entire region, built into the population the way a chord is built into a song, rather than layered on top of one afterward. The physical consequences of that harmony are not subtle either. Researchers examining skull musculature in wolf-admixed coyotes documented stronger bite mechanics than in coyotes without wolf ancestry, a difference plausibly linked to improved deer hunting ability. A 40-pound coyote struggles to bring down an adult deer alone. A 55-pound hybrid, with a wolf's jaw leverage and a wolf's bite force, handles that same prey far more efficiently. It is, in effect, the same chassis fitted with a stronger engine, identical species designation on the outside, a meaningfully different power plant underneath, built for a different class of prey than the one the species was originally designed to hunt. Later research into the broader eastern coyote population has also linked this ancestry to larger home ranges and greater dispersal capability, suggesting the wolf genes embedded in this population did more than reshape a skull. They may have helped write the very playbook that let the eastern coyote colonize new territory as efficiently and as relentlessly as it did. If you have followed the story this far, through a shot in a snowy field, through a contested skull, through 686 strands of mitochondrial DNA, you already understand the kind of channel this is. Subscribe, because the cases wildlife agencies file as closed are very often the ones still quietly rewriting themselves in the genome, one dispersing animal at a time. The wolf was not gone. It had only stopped introducing itself as one. None of this is unanimous, and it should not be presented as though it were. Serious biologists, including some of the researchers who conducted the original hybridization work, have pushed back specifically against the popular term coy wolf as an oversimplification. Their argument is that the animal in question is not a clean, uniform hybrid, but a genetically variable population. An eastern coyote whose wolf ancestry ranges widely from one individual to the next, and whose classification as a single, dramatic new creature risks flattening a genuinely complex hybridization story into pop science shorthand. That skepticism deserves to be taken seriously, not waved away as institutional stubbornness. Compounding the confusion further, the eastern wolf itself, The very lineage credited with contributing much of this ancestry remains a subject of unresolved taxonomic debate. Geneticists still disagree over whether it constitutes a distinct wolf species, a subspecies of the gray wolf, or an ancient hybrid population born from earlier wolf-coyote crossing, centuries before European settlement ever began. In other words, the species some of these coyotes are accused of secretly carrying is, itself, not entirely settled science. So the fair question is this: if wolf genes are genuinely this widespread in the northeastern coyote population, and if two confirmed full wolves have already walked hundreds of miles into New York within the last 25 years, why hasn't wildlife policy simply caught up? Why does the official record still describe the gray wolf as extirpated from a state where, by the state's own museum's genetic work, wolf DNA keeps resurfacing? Part of the answer is methodological, and the Cherry Valley case demonstrates it directly. Two accredited genetics labs tested tissue from the same animal and reached different classifications, not because either lab was wrong about the raw ancestry percentages, but because wolf and coyote are not separated by a hard genetic line. They are separated by a threshold that different labs, using different reference panels and different statistical models, can draw in slightly different places. An animal registering at 98% wolf by one lab's math can register as an eastern coyote with significant wolf ancestry by another's. That is not evidence the phenomenon isn't real. It is evidence that the boundary itself is blurrier than a wildlife regulation wants it to be. Part of the answer is coverage. Until very recently, there was no requirement in New York, and there still is not, as of this recording, to genetically test large canids killed by hunters. A bill introduced by State Senator Brad Hoylman-Sigel would require any wild canid weighing over 50 pounds to undergo state-funded DNA testing before its identity is finalized. That legislation has stalled in committee, which means that right now, the overwhelming majority of oversized coyotes taken in these woods every season are never tested at all. The Cherry Valley wolf was only tested because a hunter happened to post photographs online and advocates happened to notice. Most animals get no such attention. Absence of confirmed cases in a system with almost no mandatory testing is not the same as absence of the underlying biology. Part of the answer is decomposition and access. A carcass left in deep forest degrades within days. Usable genetic material has a narrow window, and most animals that die of natural causes, vehicle strikes, or unwitnessed predation are never recovered in any condition suitable for testing. The confirmed cases represent the rare animal that happened to die somewhere a sample could actually be pulled, not necessarily the rare animal that happened to carry unusual ancestry. And part of the answer is simply scale. The forested range in question spans multiple states and hundreds of thousands of square miles of low-density backcountry, where a genetically unusual animal can live an entire lifespan, breed, disperse, and die without a single human observer ever close enough to notice, let alone collect a sample. Put together, that is the honest state of the evidence. Not enough to confirm that a hidden wolf population thrives openly and undetected across the modern Northeast, and not enough to dismiss the idea that wolf ancestry is already more widespread and more biologically active than the official record accounts for. Two confirmed full wolves in 25 years is not a population. 686 coyotes carrying detectable wolf ancestry along a single migration corridor is not a rounding error either. Picture the hunter again, back at his tailgate in December of 2021, before any of the testing, before the disagreement between labs, before the isotope analysis and the museum's carbon signatures, and the 99.9% readout that would eventually carry his kill 500 miles back toward the Great Lakes on paper. Even though the animal itself had already made that journey on foot, alone, months or years earlier. He is only looking at a heavy, strange, dead animal in the snow, trying to decide what he actually shot. That moment, a person standing over something too large for the story they were told to expect, has repeated itself across this landscape for more than a century, in one form or another. It repeated in 1893, when a trapper near Brandreth Lake was credited with removing the last of something entirely. It repeated in 2001 in Saratoga County. It repeated again in 2021 near Cherry Valley. Officially, wolves left the Northeast a long time ago, and each of those encounters gets filed administratively as a strange exception rather than as evidence that the exit was never as clean as the paperwork suggests. Science has not solved this. Nobody credible is claiming a hidden, freely breeding wolf population roams undetected through the Adirondacks. What the genetics suggest, carefully and repeatedly, is something quieter, and in some ways stranger. That a species declared extirpated does not necessarily vanish from a landscape's biology just because it vanishes from a landscape's official count. Sometimes it keeps moving through the food web anyway, folded into an animal nobody thought to suspect, resurfacing decades later as an unusually heavy skull, an unusually strong bite, a DNA panel that reads 40% wolf inside something still wearing a coyote's paperwork. Extirpated is not the same word as gone. Somewhere in the hill country east of Cooperstown, in the forests north of the St. Lawrence, in the genome of an animal still legally classified as just a coyote, that difference is still being tested. One dispersing animal, one contested skull, one unresolved DNA panel at a time.